The battle for influence in Latin America is heating up like never before, and the stakes couldn't be higher. For decades, China has quietly cemented its presence across the region, financing ports, power grids, railways, and even digital networks, all while forging deep political ties with governments from Caracas to Buenos Aires. Now, the United States is pushing back, signaling a new era of assertiveness that some are calling the Donroe Doctrine, a modern twist on the Monroe Doctrine aimed squarely at Beijing's ambitions. Hi, I'm Livia, and in this video, we'll uncover how Washington and Beijing are fighting for control over one of the world's most resource-rich and strategically vital regions. Will the U.S. succeed in pushing China out? Or is Latin America destined to hedge its bets, navigating a delicate balance between the two global superpowers? When dawn broke over Caracas in early January 2026, the world woke to a geopolitical earthquake. The United States had carried out a precision operation that resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, dismantling the leadership of a regime that had stood for decades as a symbol of resistance to Washington. This wasn't a business-as-usual diplomatic shift. It was a strategic, hardline move that sent shockwaves across Latin America and straight to Beijing's doorstep. For years, Venezuela was one of China's closest partners in the Western Hemisphere, a relationship that bloomed in the early 2000s. As Caracas, flush with oil reserves, sought alternative sources of investment and political support. Under Hugo Chavez and then Maduro, Beijing became the regime's most important external backer, providing loans, infrastructure financing, and a steady stream of cash when most of the world recoiled from Venezuela's growing crisis. Against that backdrop, Chinese policy banks and state-linked lenders extended tens of billions of dollars, with at least an estimated $10 billion still outstanding in Chinese loans secured by oil shipments alone, cementing economic ties that intertwined Beijing's interests with Caracas's survival. But the Maduro capture was more than a blow to one government's leadership. It was a loud signal that the United States was prepared to reassert itself in its geopolitical backyard and to confront competitors on its own terms. In Washington, President Trump and senior officials openly framed the action as part of a broader strategy to counter foreign influence, especially that of China and Russia, across Latin America, invoking what commentators and some administration allies have dubbed the Donroe Doctrine, a modern reinterpretation of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, aimed at denying non-hemispheric powers control over strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere. Across the region, capitals from Mexico City to Santiago watched closely, weighing the implications. Governments that had welcomed Chinese investment in ports, power grids, and telecom infrastructure now faced a stark diplomatic calculus. Either hedge against growing U.S. pressure or risk alienating a partner that had helped fill the void left by Western retreat. In Panama, for example, the pressure contributed to a high court ruling annulling port contracts linked to a Hong Kong-associated firm that long operated at the Panama Canal, a clear sign of shifting winds in regional ties. Latin America was suddenly a stage not just for competition, but for coercion, and countries large and small would soon be forced to choose how they navigate the rising tensions between the world's two great powers. While the United States flexed its muscles in Venezuela, China's presence across Latin America was neither sudden nor accidental. For decades, Beijing has been quietly but steadily embedding itself into the economic and political fabric of the region, funding and building projects that touch almost every aspect of modern life. Ports capable of handling the largest cargo vessels, power grids lighting millions of homes, telecom networks stretching thousands of kilometers, and even massive electric vehicle factories have all been backed or built by Chinese firms, often with support from state banks and government-backed investors. This extensive footprint has not only created a network of economic interdependence, but has also positioned China as a vital partner for governments seeking infrastructure and development. According to aid data, official Chinese financing in Latin America and the Caribbean between 2000 and 2023 totaled an astonishing $302 billion, dwarfing what the U.S. has invested in comparable projects over the same period. Trade between the region and China has surged alongside this investment, reaching nearly $500 billion annually. with China recording its largest ever trade surplus of $1.2 trillion in 2025, a remarkable 8% increase over the previous year. These figures underline not just the scale but the strategic weight of Beijing's engagement. China's focus has often been on sectors with both economic and geopolitical significance. In Peru, Chinese companies dominate copper mining. In Argentina and Chile, they extract vast amounts of lithium, a critical element for the global electric vehicle market. Power grids in Peru, Chile, and Brazil are operated by Chinese state-backed firms, while telecom giants such as Huawei and ZTE equip digital networks throughout South America, including more than 8,000 kilometers of optical fiber across the Amazon rainforest. Electric vehicle companies like BYD and Great Wall Motors have opened massive factories in Brazil, filling gaps left by departing U.S. firms. But these investments go beyond economics. They have strengthened political bonds, allowing Beijing to woo countries away from Taiwan and reinforce China's role as a leader among developing economies. By financing infrastructure and development projects that Western governments were often unwilling or unable to support, China has built trust, influence, and loyalty. For Xi Jinping, these relationships are not just commercial, they are strategic levers that expand China's global sway, creating a network of aligned governments that can support Beijing on diplomatic, trade, and security matters. In short, China's decades-long presence in Latin America has transformed the region into a critical stage in the global rivalry between Beijing and Washington, one where infrastructure, trade, and strategic resources are tools of influence as powerful as armies or alliances. As China expanded its footprint across Latin America, the United States began to rethink a region long considered its own backyard. In December, Washington released a new national security strategy that left little doubt about its intentions. The U.S. would deny non-hemispheric competitors control over strategically vital assets in the Western Hemisphere. This marked a dramatic shift from decades of cautious diplomacy, reflecting growing concern that China's infrastructure investments, trade networks, and strategic partnerships could one day be leveraged in ways that threaten U.S. influence or security. The battle is only just beginning. Stay tuned as we continue to track the shifts in global power. I'm Livia. Thanks for watching. At the center of this strategy is the concept of dual-use infrastructure, projects that, while commercial on the surface, could serve military or strategic purposes if a crisis arose. Key examples include the deep-water Chanque port in Peru, operated by a joint venture dominated by China's state-owned shipping giant COSCO, which the U.S. Department of Defense has flagged for potential ties to the Chinese military, and a deep space station in Argentina, co-managed by China for research purposes. These assets exemplify the kind of strategic choke points that Washington now aims to monitor, regulate, or even wrest control from foreign hands. Historically, the U.S. hesitated to confront China directly in Latin America, balancing respect for national sovereignty against commercial realities. But under the Trump administration, this caution has shifted to a far more aggressive posture. The Panama Canal case illustrates this change. After decades of Chinese-linked operations at the canal, Panama's Supreme Court annulled contracts held by a Hong Kong-associated firm, a symbolic yet significant victory for Washington, even if the practical removal of the firm remains slow and complex. To counter China's financial leverage, the U.S. has also begun offering alternatives to Latin American governments, aiming to make Washington the partner of choice for large-scale development projects. In December, the U.S. tripled the budget of the Development Finance Corporation, its primary vehicle for overseas investment, signaling an intention to match or compete with Chinese funding. Earlier, the U.S. extended an emergency credit line to Argentina's central bank, a country heavily reliant on Chinese loans for infrastructure, sending a clear message. Washington is willing to back its geopolitical interests with tangible financial tools. Together, these moves signal a new era of assertiveness, one in which the United States is no longer content to watch China's influence grow unchecked. Latin American nations now face a stark choice: align with U.S. interests, maintain ties with China, or attempt to navigate a perilous middle ground, a balancing act that could redefine the region's political and economic landscape for decades to come. As China's presence in Latin America grew, Washington began to shift from cautious observation to decisive action. The U.S. national security strategy released in December made its intentions clear. It seeks to deny non-hemispheric competitors control over strategically vital assets across the Western Hemisphere. This marked a turning point from decades of measured diplomacy, reflecting concern that Chinese investments in ports, power grids, and other infrastructure could be leveraged for influence, or even military advantage in ways that threaten U.S. interests. Central to this strategy is the concept of dual-use infrastructure, projects that may appear commercial but could serve strategic or military purposes if tensions escalate. The deepwater Chancay port in Peru, for instance, is operated by a joint venture controlled by China's state-owned shipping giant COSCO, which the U.S. Department of Defense has linked to the Chinese military. Likewise, a deep space station in Argentina, jointly operated with China, exemplifies projects that, while framed as scientific or technological cooperation, could become strategic assets in a future conflict. For decades, the United States hesitated to confront China directly in Latin America, balancing respect for sovereignty with the commercial realities of foreign investment. Under the Trump administration, however, that restraint has given way to a more assertive stance. The Panama Canal case demonstrates this shift. After years of Chinese-linked operations, Panama's Supreme Court annulled contracts held by a Hong Kong-associated firm. While the removal of the company remains a complex process, the ruling served as a symbolic victory, signaling Washington's intent to challenge Chinese control over critical infrastructure. At the same time, the U.S. is actively offering alternatives to Chinese financing. In December, it tripled the budget of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, expanding its ability to fund infrastructure and industrial projects across the region. Earlier, the U.S. extended an emergency credit line to Argentina's central bank, a country heavily dependent on Chinese loans. These moves send a clear message. Washington is ready to match Chinese influence with financial tools, using both carrots and sticks to pull Latin American nations into its orbit. Together, these measures reflect a new era of U.S. assertiveness in the hemisphere. Countries in the region now face difficult choices: align with Washington, maintain ties with Beijing, or attempt the delicate balancing act of hedging between two global powers. The decisions they make in the coming months and years could redefine Latin America's political, economic, and strategic landscape for decades. While Washington moves assertively, Beijing has been quietly signaling that it is neither intimidated nor retreating. From China's perspective, Latin America is a long-term strategic partner, and its approach emphasizes engagement, reassurance, and flexibility rather than confrontation. Policymakers in Beijing understand the growing U.S. pressure, but rather than abandoning the region, they are recalibrating how Chinese firms and state-backed initiatives operate, shifting the focus toward development sectors that are less likely to be framed as security threats. A striking example of China's soft power strategy is the People's Liberation Army hospital ship, the Silk Road Ark, which has been touring Latin American ports. While its primary mission is humanitarian, providing medical care to underserved communities, the timing of the deployment coincided with the U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean. For Beijing, the hospital ship is both a tangible demonstration of goodwill and a subtle signal that China remains present and influential without escalating military tensions. In addition to these high-profile gestures, China recently released a policy paper on Latin America, outlining dozens of areas for expanded collaboration, including aerospace, law enforcement, green energy, public health, and economic resilience. By emphasizing sectors that are constructive and clearly development-oriented, Beijing seeks to reassure regional governments that its presence is focused on mutual growth and stability rather than military confrontation or coercion. Analysts in China and abroad note that this strategy is as much about optics as it is about substance. Latin American countries are increasingly aware of U.S. pressure, but many remain cautious about fully aligning with Washington at the expense of Beijing. In the words of Sun Chenghao of Tsinghua University, China's engagement is about reassurance, signaling to Latin American partners that China does not seek military presence or block confrontation, but long-term development cooperation and mutual economic resilience. As the rivalry intensifies, the region remains the ultimate prize. Stay tuned for more. I'm Livia, thanks for watching. Even if some nations temporarily respond to U.S. demands, Beijing's analysts expect that in the long term, countries will seek alternatives to avoid becoming overly dependent on Washington. Latin America's governments may continue working with China where development, infrastructure, and trade incentives align with their national interests, demonstrating that Beijing's influence is likely to persist, though in a more nuanced and calibrated form. Through soft power, targeted investments, and strategic reassurance, China is positioning itself to maintain and even deepen its influence in Latin America, showing that flexibility and long-term planning can be as effective as aggressive military or financial maneuvers. Latin America now stands at the center of a geopolitical tug-of-war, and for many countries in the region, the stakes are nothing short of economic transformation or strategic vulnerability. Chinese-backed projects are increasingly seen as engines of growth, from the massive deep-water Chancay port in Peru, which promises to become one of Latin America's largest maritime hubs and a direct gateway for exports to Asia, to electric vehicle factories in Brazil and ambitious rail corridors linking inland industrial zones to Pacific ports. These are not small undertakings. They are economic lifelines capable of generating jobs, slashing transportation costs, and integrating regional trade in ways that once seemed out of reach. For countries like Peru, China's involvement has meant the rapid modernization of logistics infrastructure that could propel the nation into a leading role in global mineral and agricultural exports. Brazil's pursuit of rail links connecting its resource-rich interior with Pacific ports, discussed in partnership with China, speaks to the transformative potential of cross-continental connectivity that could cut shipping times and boost competitiveness. But these economic opportunities come with profound trade-offs. While Chinese projects can accelerate growth and fill investment gaps left by Western lenders, they also raise U.S. security concerns about dependency on infrastructure that could be leveraged for strategic influence. Critics in Washington warn that deep-water ports and extensive transportation networks could have dual-use potential, meaning they might serve commercial purposes in peacetime but be repurposed in geopolitical crises. Such fears now shape U.S. policy and diplomatic pressure across the hemisphere. This leaves many governments in a difficult dilemma. Accept the economic benefits of working with China and risk friction with the United States, or align with U.S. interests and potentially sacrifice urgently needed development. In Venezuela and Panama, this tension has already played out publicly, with shifts in alliances and legal battles over strategic infrastructure. Experts caution that unless the United States can offer credible alternatives, investments that match China's depth of capital and willingness to finance large-scale projects, Latin American nations are unlikely to abandon opportunities for industrial growth and modernization. Without robust U.S. engagement on development and infrastructure financing, the region may continue to hedge, leveraging ties with both powers while pursuing its own economic agenda, a complex balancing act with long-term implications for global influence. Latin America is rapidly emerging as a high-stakes test case in the global rivalry between the United States and China. The region is no longer just a source of raw materials or a market for exports. It has become a stage where infrastructure, energy, ports, and digital networks, much of it funded or operated by China, could serve as leverage in times of geopolitical tension. Deep-water ports, strategic rail lines, energy grids, and telecommunications systems are all dual-use assets, commercially vital in peacetime, yet potentially strategic in moments of conflict. Washington and Beijing alike understand the implications, and each move reverberates across the hemisphere. For Latin American countries, this rivalry presents both opportunity and risk. On one hand, China offers capital, technology, and expertise to modernize infrastructure, build industrial capacity, and advance digital connectivity. On the other, U.S. pressure, whether through sanctions, diplomatic influence, or the threat of excluding nations from key financial systems, raises the cost of engagement with Beijing. Governments from Panama to Peru to Venezuela must weigh these competing incentives carefully, often hedging their policies to avoid alienating either superpower. The choices they make will shape their economic autonomy, industrial development, and political alliances for decades. China's strategy, however, is deliberately calculated. Rather than responding to U.S. assertiveness with confrontation, Beijing has signaled stability, long-term presence, and reassurance, emphasizing sectors that appear development-focused and less susceptible to accusations of strategic militarization. Investments in green energy, rail networks, and public health allow China to maintain influence without escalating military tensions. Analysts suggest this approach is not a retreat, but a recalibration, positioning China to maintain and even deepen ties as Latin American countries navigate a complex geopolitical landscape. Ultimately, the region's long-term trajectory may reflect a new kind of global competition, where nations leverage the rivalry between Washington and Beijing to pursue their own development goals. Latin America is no longer a passive arena, but an active player, capable of shaping outcomes by balancing economic benefits, strategic risks, and the influence of the world's two most powerful nations. The contest between the United States and China in Latin America is far from over, and its outcome will shape the region's political, economic, and strategic future for years to come. As we've seen, countries are weighing opportunities for development, infrastructure, and industrial growth against the pressures and security concerns from Washington. Latin American nations are not passive players. They are carefully navigating a complex landscape, balancing relationships with two global superpowers while seeking autonomy and long-term prosperity. If you found this analysis insightful, subscribe to Global Shift Analysis for daily deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you see the US and China influencing the Americas in the coming years? Stay informed, stay aware, and follow the shifts that are quietly redefining global power.